The debate about global warming seems to be focusing less these days on the question of whether climate change is real and more on the issue of how to respond to it. And yet, here in the United States of America, there doesn't seem to be any real sense of urgency about climate change. If you're one of those who's in no particular hurry to deal with it, there is a documentary called The Age of Consequences that might change your mind. In it, filmmaker Jared P. Scott frames the issue of climate change as a threat to U.S. national security.
We built society on this assumption of climate stability, and that stability is changing. All these things we take for granted, they're not just givens anymore.
The just released report from the Pentagon, climate change and the challenges it's creating for the military.
The latest report says global warming is driving weather to new levels of extremes.
If 99% of my intelligence told me there's an ambush waiting for me, I don't get to say, yeah, but there's that 1% that says there's no ambush, so the hell with the other 99%.
As a member of the United States military and 30-plus years of service in uniform, climate change is what we call an accelerant to instability.
If you have an area that is already unstable and then has the additional challenge of water shortages or food shortages or a disaster that makes people move, then you can start seeing conflict situations.
Jared P. Scott, so much has been said and written about climate change. What led you to make The Age of Consequences and to frame the issue through the lens of U.S. national security?
Yeah, I've never seen a film that has covered climate change quite like this. I mean, we set out to try to make a film that would start a different type of kitchen table conversation about this issue. I think so often, unfortunately, climate change is seen as this partisan issue. And when you look at climate change as an issue of national security or global security, it's basically a risk assessment. You have to see how climate change can be one of several factors that can interact and agitate and overlap other socio-political factors along with climate change to create conflict or to fuel unrest. Climate change is just one of those factors, and I think that that perspective, it starts to paint a picture that can be quite frightening. So on one hand, it's alarming. On one hand, it's slightly refreshing because it might open the door for people to look at this issue, provide an entry point where otherwise they didn't respond to it.
How did you go about connecting the dots, as it were, in order to show how a drought or a flood in one part of the world can impact the stability of an entire region or even global stability?
The Pentagon calls climate change a threat multiplier. They also cite it in several reports as an accelerant of instability or conflict. So just take this idea of threat multiplier. It's not a difficult concept to understand. It takes threats and it multiplies them. It takes problems and it makes it worse. Climate change can make everything worse. We've heard it being called the great exacerbator. What's a little more nuanced is just exactly how all of those things do interact. We created this map, this nexus that connected these dots and showed how these factors all interrelate. And it's not a linear type of map, it's systems thinking. You can look at the World Economics Forum, global risk assessment, and you can see the same type of connecting of the dots. It's a storytelling technique that we're able to utilize in the film to keep the audience following a certain thread. Okay, there's a visual cue. Now I know I'm back to that matrix or that nexus. Okay, it's kind of coming in and out in different chapters throughout different case studies. So for us, it's a tool not just for clarity and as a story technique, but also it's visually compelling. And I think all those help people understand exactly what it is that we're laying out in our hypothesis in this film.
How does climate change interact with societal tensions and spark a wide array of conflicts?
Climate change historically has always been a factor. I mean, you can go back to early civilizations, the Mayan civilization, Tang Dynasty, pre-Columbian cultures. There's been climactic shifts that have happened. So when people, you often hear it on maybe the skeptic side, they'll say, well, climate change has always been happening. And yeah, it has. I mean, at one point the Earth was a ball of ice. So the idea that climate is an issue, that's no doubt always been the case. What we're saying now in the Anthropocene, what we've done recently, is we've now put our fingerprint on it. We know now that we can look at the CO2 and we can say, all right, We know what's naturally occurring that's been there for X amount of time, but we can tell what we've burned from fossil fuels because there's different isotopes, right? There's C11, C12, C13. You can see where humans have basically burnt something from fossil fuels, and that's now contributed to the altered chemical composition of our atmosphere. Therefore, we've put our fingerprint on it now. So climate has always been a factor, but now we have this human interference. We have this X factor that is now fueling climate change. That's where we get anthropogenic climate change, man-made global warming. And that's what we're talking about in this film, because you always have had these subtle shifts. And we're going to have climatic shifts, but we are now juicing that. It's just like the baseball analogy, right? Baseball players always hit home runs, but now we know that as soon as people started juicing up and using steroids, they're hitting more home runs, and they're hitting them further. So they're more frequent and they're more severe, just like storms, just like our weather. Same idea. So we're looking at climate as a factor now with that human interference, the man-made climate change, AGW, anthropogenic global warming. That is what we're experiencing as one of the factors with these other social political factors that can lead to unrest, to conflict, to food shortages, water shortages, you name it. And it's how that all interacts with our fingerprint that should really frighten us.
You're showing a lot of scary stuff in this documentary. Is it your intention to scare people to a call to action?
No, I think, as one of the interviewees, Dr. Christian Parenti says, I think what people need more than a fright is a credible description of a way out of the problem. We're just looking at data. We're just looking at facts. We're just observing. If people think that the science is alarming, fair enough, it is alarming. I don't think that scientists are alarmists or that the military is alarmist or that anyone that talks about this issue is alarmist. It's just that the facts that we're presented with are indeed alarming. They should, in some way, I guess, frighten us. But that doesn't mean that we use fear as a tactic. I think that we use education, we use information, we use observation. We use those as tactics. Now, if you take that and you throw up your hands, that's your choice. Or if you take that and you go, God, we have to move on this. We have to invest in solar, we have to adapt, we have to build a resilient society, we have to get involved in issues of climate justice, we have to recognize these potential problems. That's the intent, that's the hope. The hope is that people go out, realize the severity of the problem, the urgency of the problem, and go out and do something about it.
What makes so many Americans complacent about the issue of global warming?
We have a tendency to think in the short term. Our politics, as we can all see, incredibly short term, incredibly short-sighted. The military has to be a little more long-term in their thinking, which is why, again, we use their perspective in this film. I think for most Americans, we have a finite pool of worry. Heidi Collin talks about this beautifully. There's only so many things that we can actually worry about. Can my kids go to school? Will they get into college? Can I afford it? My retirement, my job, you name it. There's only so many things we can actually worry about. And so climate change doesn't often get put in that pool. It gets set out here. On some level too, we're all beneficiaries of cheap fossil fuels. We are victims, but we're also perpetrators. So we have to take a really hard look in the mirror, not just at ourselves and our behaviors and our attitudes, but just how all of society is functioning. We are dependent on this single source. We're moving away from it slowly, but not fast enough. So fossil fuels play a huge role in our lives. And once you would recognize there's a problem, right? As in the film, we try to say, hey, look, there's a problem. And we hope that you're inclined to find a solution. When you are informed, you're supposed to then, do something about it. That's why I think Al Gore used the word inconvenient truth. Because it is very inconvenient. Because once you recognize it, you have to do something about it, right? It's a tough thing for us to look at our lives and truly make the big changes that need to happen. I can see why people choose to push it away. But if we keep kicking the can down the road, a lot of people think it's too late already. And we know we can't stop climate change, but we can avoid cataclysmic disaster. So the question is, are we going to do that? And yeah, we have to get real about this, and we got to get real about it now.
What is your reaction to the ongoing debate in this country about whether climate change is real and who's causing it? Even though it's pretty much settled science that there is global warming and that it is man-made, What are your thoughts about why we're still debating this?
As you said, 97% of scientists say that climate change is happening, that it's man-made, and that the primary driver are greenhouse gases, CO2, methane, you name it. So there's this fraction of people that don't say that. But imagine if you were going to go in the operating room, or actually let's say like your son, your daughter, and the doctor looked at you and said, well, look, I'm one of 97 doctors that believe you should have this heart transplant. But there's those 3 doctors over there that don't believe it. They say, don't do the transplant. What are you going to do? I mean, of course, you're going to go with the 97 doctors that say have this procedure. So it's the same thing with climate change. I mean, and we mentioned it in the film. The military angle is Michael Breen, the former Army captain, says, look, if 98% of my intelligence tells me that, there's going to be an ambush, that's what I'm going to listen to. Even if there's this 2% that says, well, maybe not, maybe you're fine. I don't know if there's going to be that ambush. If he was to listen to that 2%, that would be negligence on an unfathomable scale, as he says. And that's the conversation that we're having in climate. That's how he frames it. What you're talking about as this debate, or it's political. Climate change is about physics. Physics doesn't care about what your political position might be. Now, I think that I would welcome a political debate over the carbon fee, over a carbon tax, over different ways to deal with this. But the fact that it's politically charged to just accept it or not, I don't know, that kind of baffles me. And that's truly unfortunate, because it's not helping the situation that we're in. I mean, a lot of people, unfortunately, then get this misinformation sent their way, and I think that clouds the debate, that clouds us moving forward. And until the popular pressure is sufficient, where there's no political points that can be scored from taking those positions of inaction or denial or skepticism, until we force our politicians to know, so they know that they're not going to get reelected, or that's no longer accepted. Until that happens, they're going to keep doing it.
Are other countries still debating this?
But look at Paris. The rest of the world's still saying, we're going to move on. But you do have, it's tough to move on when you have the biggest emitter in the aggregate and per capita saying we might not honor our agreement, because this isn't binding. We might, that's a huge blow to the international community. That's a huge blow to this collective approach to deal with this on a global level. That's a huge blow. So clearly the rest of the world is on a certain track and wants to be, and the U.S. just needs to step up and lead. At the very least, don't roll back everything. My hope with this film is that this diffuses the partisanship, because the military is supposed to be an apolitical organization. People think it's a competent institution. It has higher approval ratings than Congress and the executive branch. This is a place where I'm hoping that the messengers diffuse that partisanship, because no matter where you're at on both sides of the aisle as a politician in this country, you believe in a strong national security agenda. And if this is a part of that, well, then you got to accept it. And if you believe in supporting the troops, you understand that veterans get this. You do have 10% of the solar workforce now made up of US vets. That's astounding. That's giant. And every 5 years, that's doubling. And hopefully that'll continue to double even more, faster. You have 70,000 coal jobs. No vets are going into coal. You have 260,000 solar jobs. The only industry, and the energy industry that outflanks solar is oil. Besides that, this is where the jobs are. It's not in fracking, it's not in coal, it's not in dirty fossil fuels. It's in solar installations. And those are jobs that can't be exported. You need someone who's going to come to your house, install it, maintain it, and oftentimes those people are men and women that once were in uniform. That's pretty astounding. So if you can see the national security threat on this end, and you can see the support of vets on this end, national security threat, solutions with the solar and renewables, then I think it's a no-brainer for anybody, any politician, no matter where they're at on the political spectrum, to see climate change through this lens.
In this day and age of fractured media, how do you get people to pay attention to a film like The Age of Consequences, especially when so much has been said and written about the issue of global warming?
I'd like to think that what we're creating is also cinematic and artful and entertaining, because at the end of the day, I can't just say, well, this is good for you, therefore you should watch it. I have to try to woo you with imagery and with sound and with story and with the presentation of information. So it's not just finding solutions to these big problems, but it's also navigating that media landscape to all sorts of things. I mean, you go back to that finite pool of worry. There's a tremendous amount of stuff. People always ask me, what can I do? They want that one thing. We suffer from the single action bias. Give me that one thing to do and I'll do it and I'll be done. The founding fathers were right. Eternal vigilance is the price of liberty. This is a lifelong commitment to a greater democratic process. So whether it's an issue of climate change or healthcare or education or how we relate to each other, all of these issues involve nonstop, day in, day out commitments to trying to be a more enlightened citizenry, to be a more informed citizenry, and to go out there and make changes and talk to people and actually further this democratic experiment as opposed to give in to the corrosive forces that are there trying to undermine our democracy. This is something that we have to work on day in, day out, and that is a huge challenge. And that's the single action: never stop. Never stop. And I think if we throw up our hands, then I understand the temptation, but there's no courage in that. I mean, granted, we have to be optimistic, and it has to be a sobering optimism. But I do think we have to go out there and keep trying to build a better planet, a better place, because we know what'll happen if we don't do anything. And we don't necessarily know what'll happen if we keep all trying to do the right thing. But maybe that's the answer. It's like not to sound trite, but it's not where we end up, but it's the process, right? Not everyone gets a chance to say they truly fought for things that they believed in their life. And we can do that day in, day out on these issues of importance to our democracy and to our planet.
Jared P. Scott is the director of the film The Age of Consequences. Jared P. Scott, thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thank you.